Hello everybody and welcome to another Art Newspaper live event in partnership with London Gallery Weekend. And first of all, many thanks to our sponsors Crozier and also to Ed Elasanti for allowing us to host this event in their wonderful space surrounded by these fantastic Lonnie Holly artworks. I mean, how great to be actually in an exhibition in London Gallery Art Week. It's what it's all about. And the subject of this panel is what makes an ethical collector? And what better subject as we are about to kick off with London Gallery Weekend? And if there were no collectors, there'd be no galleries. There'd be no London Gallery Weekend whatsoever. So we really do need to kind of tease out this topic, and I think it's a really key one. And we've got the perfect panel here to do this now, which is absolutely fantastic. I mean, without artists, there'd be no art world at all. No London Gallery Weekend, no galleries whatsoever. So to have Jane and Louise Wilson here is absolutely fantastic. A real treat. They were the joint curators, coordinators of the Royal Academy Summer, but it wasn't actually summer, it was autumn-winter lockdown Academy show. They've been working together for over 30 years. They were nominated for the Turner Prize for their multi-screen installation Gamma in 1999, and rather more currently and very essentially, they've got a fantastic show at Maureen Paley on at the moment and Studio M in London, so I urge you all to go to that. And then we've bagged a real collector. They're quite shy beasts, these collectors, but this brave man has come out, and we're not going to give him too hard a time because he's a fantastic collector. David Roberts, one of the best around, and he's the founder of the David Roberts Institute of Art, a non-profit contemporary arts organisation that commissions performance art, collaborates with national partners on exhibitions all over the place, across the country, across the world, and also works to research to share the David Andre Roberts collection, which he has with his lovely wife. So his day job, by the way, is the co-founder and chief executive of Edinburgh House Estates, a commercial property investment and asset management company, which makes this gorgeous collecting possible. And then to offer an institutional perspective, because yes, the London Gallery Weekend is about commercial galleries, but you know the endorsement, the importance of our public sector obviously can't be underestimated. And we've bagged fantastic Deborah Smith, the director of the Arts Council collection. It's the most widely circulated loan collection of modern and contemporary British art. And she's also worked as a curator for a number of decades for everybody, it seems. The Hayward Touring, the New Art Gallery, Walsall, Norfolk and Norwich Festival, Camden Art Centre, Chapter, the Contemporary Art Society, Birmingham Museums Trust, Serpentine Galleries. I mean, how much more qualified can you be? So that's fantastic to have you here, Deborah. And last but absolutely not least, Niru Ratnam, who offered the briefest of biogs when we asked for a biog. It was a gallerist based in Soho, London. He used to be a writer. Well, I'm going to expand a bit on that because his gallery just off Carnaby Street, which he opened in the middle of the pandemic, bravely and magnificently, is one of London's most refreshing newcomers on the scene, working with great artists Linda Blakely, Emma Cousin, Adam Famanui, Matthew Krishnu, and now he's currently showing a remarkable comeback from Luke Atterman. So great to see him back again, not just in the West End Gallery of Carnaby Street, but also in a pop-up in Denman Place. So what a panel. And so I'm going to kick off right now with David, because we're talking about collecting. So could you just talk a little bit about what got you started collecting? I mean, your collection, you've got 2,500 works, 850 artists, so it's by no means a small-scale collection, but you also specialise in commissioning performance art, which is not what most collectors do. It's a brave leap, and also you now have a foundation, an institute. So could you just talk a little bit about that journey and what kind of shapes your approach?
Well, when I started collecting art, it was really to decorate the house. I mean, it wasn't, it was in the 90s. There wasn't any great plan. I've always, my original career path before I got involved in property was as a naval architect. So I've always liked design and drawing. And to begin with, I started collecting prints because I couldn't really afford anything else. And then as business got better and I could afford to buy paintings or sculptures or whatever else from artists, from galleries, that's exactly what I did. And it sort of became its own thing. It sort of gained momentum and became something that was very difficult not to take part in. And the more people you meet, the more galleries you meet, particularly the more artists you meet, because it's one of the most interesting parts of it is meeting the artists, whether old or young. The collection grew to the extent that the office was full, the house was full, everything was full. And then there was a warehouse which started to be full. And around about 2006, 2007, some friends of mine suggested that we should try and do something with collection rather than just let it stagnate in a warehouse somewhere and change occasionally at home. And they introduced me to Vincent Honoré, who we decided to do what was then called the David Roberts Art Foundation. We took a small space not far from here, actually, just up the road. And Vincent joined us, and he was very keen that it shouldn't be a vanity project for the collector. It should be something more than that. And he was the person who began to get me involved and interested in performance art. But also, he was very keen that the foundation should encourage young artists, mid-career artists that had perhaps been forgotten, particularly young curators, as they found it very difficult to get a leg up on the first ladder. And we sort of took it from there. And then we ended up taking a space in Camden, which we ran for nearly 10 years.
There's amazing performance nights.
Well, we
during
did. We did a lot of performance nights there, yeah. But I think everything we've done has been evolving sort of as it's gone along. We haven't. There hasn't been. The plan has always been for the next 2 or 3 years, and then there comes a point where you think, well, are we enjoying this? Are we still having fun doing it? And if the answer to that's no, then we try to find something else to do.
Yeah, but you were always very transparent. It was very interesting. I remember the Mornington Crescent space that, that you'd have the labels for the works and you'd put the provenance, you got where you bought them from. I'm not sure we actually put the price, but you damn nearly did.
Yeah.
It was very unusual. You never normally see that in a collection, the kind of the purchasing background to an artwork. I thought that was very telling from early on. I mean, you say on your website you want a social and open-minded outlook, but that was pretty transparent to show that.
But that's something that always interests me. I mean, I was very happy for Vincent to do that on the basis that if I go to a museum show or a gallery that's where there's a history to the work as opposed to its new primary works, I am interested in where they've been and when they were painted and normally it's just the name of the artist and when it was painted or made or whatever. And I'm quite interested to know the history of the work.
I'm just going to come over to Deborah in a minute and talk a bit more about institutional collecting. One last quick question. I mean, I don't know many other collectors that collect performance art. It's not something that, you can get a good secondary market on or you can display.
We don't collect performance art. We don't have a single performance piece in the collection at all. We decided very early on that rather than buy a performance, we'd much rather commission performances because I think it's much better to instigate performance and give people a chance to have the financing and the ability to show those works than actually to own them within the collect. I mean, obviously we have a record of them. We film everything as it's going along, but no, we don't actually own any performances.
Now that's very interesting. So now I want an institutional point of view, Deborah. I want to hear about the Arts Council collection. It's been going for 75 years. It's a fantastic thing for an artist to be in that kind of public collection. I mean, we're going to talk more about what it means for artists to enter collections in their different sort of way. But, you've done, as I said in the intro, a formidable amount of curating. You've interfaced with a lot of commercial galleries and indeed collectors. But just a little bit about, first of all, just how the Arts Council collection operates, because you have a changing selection committee. So it's obviously, it's equality, what the choices you make, how you make, and how it evolves. It'd be really interesting to hear, just to get a bit of shape about how that happens.
Thank you. Well, we were 75 last year, and 76 this year, and we are part of we're the keepers of Arts Council England's collection, which started, as we said, in 1946, and they were part of Maynard Keynes' vision for entering art into a much broader context, certainly after the Second World War. And it was called CEMA at that point, which was the Committee for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, of which 76 works entered the collection at that point, all oil paintings at that time. And the first exhibition was called Sculpture in the Home, which was where it was placing sculpture into the context of a house so that people could actually see what it was like to live with artworks on an everyday basis. So it was bringing art into a different context. We now have just over 8,000 works by 2,100 artists in our collection, and we continue to buy every year. And as you described, we're working, we have a really eclectic collection because every 2 years we rotate our acquisitions committee. So I'm really pleased to announce that this year we have Simeon Barclay, the artist. We always have an artist on our committee. We've got Vanessa Peterson, who is an editor and writer at Frieze. We've got Marie Anne from the Blue Coat Gallery, and Harriet Cooper from Jerwood. So really going out there, they're our eyes and ears. They suggest artworks, and in amongst that we have Nicholas Sirota, who's our chair. He's Arts Council England's...
Formerly Emperor of Tate, of course. Yeah.
I wasn't quite going to put it like that, but thank you. We've got Peter Heslip, who is the Visual Arts Director, and Ralph Rogoff from the Hayward, and myself. So we're all the eyes and ears out there. We bring back the works to debate, discuss, and they enter into the collection for our keep, for years to come. We conserve them, we look after them. I'm really excited. In 2024, we're moving to our collection to a new home together to allow us to grow. As you said, you've outgrown some of your storage. We have equally, and we're moving to Coventry. Not being sent to Coventry, we're moving to Coventry.
But it's interesting that on the website it says the acquisitions policy is characterised by a spirit of risk-taking. I mean, how risky is a risk-taking? I mean, have you someone's gone, oh, that's too much? Or, I mean, it is public money, it's a public collection. You don't, I imagine, de-accession. Once it's there, it's there. So I'm curious about this risk-taking. I mean, it ties in with the sort of ethics in a way about how you decide what's worth taking the risk for, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the voice that comes through from our acquisitions committee and those debates and discussions we had. So last year we talked a lot about black figuration and representation and how that fits and how that voice represents our community today. So there's lots of different debates according to, Black Lives Matter had a big impact in what we were looking at and the works that the public would like to see. What I should context here is that we are buying works for a national context. Museums, galleries can lend for free the collections, and we're extending our reach to working in schools, certainly after the pandemic when children weren't going into museums and galleries.
So it's to make a collection much more active and more kind of present in the community, not just to be seen in the kind of hallowed space of the museum or the gallery is what you're sort of saying.
Well, that's really active. That's what we're working towards in a much deeper context.
I'm going to cut to Jane and Louise now because we've got a lot of turf to cover here. I mean, you're on the receiving end of collectors and collections. You are in the Arts Council collection, not yet in the David Roberts collection, but who knows? I mean, you've seen the scene change a lot, and the market expand, and collectors change. And Deborah's touched on some of the differences in people's kind of, priorities and things that need to be put to the forefront. So I'm going to ask you a kind of contentious question. I'm also going to ask Niru, what do you feel makes the difference between someone that buys art and a collector? What makes a collector? Before we even start to drill into ethics, what is the difference basically between, in your view, somebody who buys art and a collector?
I think, a collector supports a whole ecosystem, which is essential to the art world because, they're not only engaging with artists, but with the galleries and also with museums, public museums and institutions, and hopefully foundations as well. So I think it's a very key role. It's a very, very different position to someone who's just buying art as such. It's much more engaged.
I think it's also important to add that they commission, and actually commissioning artworks is actually one of the big platforms for artists who are emerging are starting to actually get going with their work. And I think that's an essential part of the risk-taking that they do when they're brave and they ask difficult questions and they support difficult, uncommercial artworks. Sometimes that's really quite impressive.
I mean, when your career kicks off, I mean, obviously, you're a few years along the line career-wise, and your Royal Academicians, for heaven's sake, Turner Prize winners, all this. But I mean,
nominated.
Yeah, but when you're well, you should have won. Yeah. but when you're being at the beginning of your career, and also now, I mean, you're now with the wonderful Maureen Paley, but who's going to shape your career, who's going to shape your collection, your legacy. Yeah. So it's really important who buys your work, and right from the word go, too,
It is. I mean, it's interesting. We're actually in discussion now. Jane and I sold a work, the Crammett Collection, in 1995, and it was one of the first video single-screen pieces we made that was shot in 16mm and telecine to video, and it's a piece called Crawl Space, which we're currently remastering with them. So we've still continued the conversation with them, with that collection, and with them as collectors, and their support has been continuous since the 90s, really. So it's a very important relationship that we have with them. Yeah.
That continues.
That continues.
And also just to add as well that there was a commissioning that we had in the early 2000s where we managed to make a trilogy of works looking at Star City and looking at Baikonur Cosmodrome, and also filming a piece called Dreamtime, which was the first manned space mission to the ISS. And those are things that the Bowen Foundation supported and subsequently donated to the Guggenheim. So those are very, very critical points. Again, commercial work, again, non-commercial in some ways, because it's it's installation and difficult, but they were supported.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I imagine you attract a certain kind of collector. They're not going to want your work to go with the soft furnishings because it's film, it's installation. Okay, it's photographic work, but that's immediately. I guess that has a bit of a Darwinian sort of narrowing down of who's going to be actually looking at your work.
But it's interesting as well, because I think, I'm sure it's here the case in the UK as well, but certainly in the US, I think collectors there have a kind of responsibility to donate to museums as well, which is, there are certain tax incentives, but also there's a certain ethical code of conduct, if you like, but there's also support there that, in the US, they really do, as public institutions, rely on that support from collectors. And so when your work is then donated to a museum, of course, it's a great honour, of course.
Well, drill into that ethical code of conduct down the line. But Niru, I wanted to talk to you because, you're representing artists, you're placing works with collectors, private and public. Obviously, public collections, it's great to get that endorsement, but, private collectors are your bread and butter. I mean, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's the difference between a collector and someone who buys art? When you're sizing someone up in the gallery and think, do you really deserve this great piece?
I mean, I think I'd just sound a note of caution about that, because I think anyone who chooses to spend their money on art rather than, say, a holiday to the Maldives can be a collector. And I think we're in danger of having this great unwashed mass of buyers who we ignore. And to be honest with you, if they're going to buy a work of art, and if they see themselves as a collector, they're a collector. But I think what we're trying to distinguish between are unengaged collectors who buy art, and it might be one piece every 5 years, it might be 10 pieces every 3 years, and engaged collectors. And David said something which is very simple. Collectors who want to do something. You said at some point you thought, I want to do something. The second point is, sometimes those things they do are lovely. And Jane and Louise covered all the lovely bits. But it's also important to recognise that sometimes the things that you do as a collector, an engaged collector, aren't so lovely. So that
Examples, please.
Yeah, it could be, taking work and thinking, well, I'm buying this, sticking in a crate, and I hope to resell it in the Philips online sale in a few years' time. I didn't just want to pick on Philips. Anyway, we'll do.
Any auction
and I, obviously, I think that's a question which I think we probably need to tease out. Which of these bits of engagement are perhaps less helpful? Are they less helpful, but in fact, in the whole scheme of things, not that bad? Or are they less helpful and actually a bad thing, which we should highlight? And also, the last thing I'd like to say is we also need to leave a little bit of room for unethical collectors, because they have their place as well. And I remember...
Can you define an unethical collector?
Well, the first gallery I ran back in the early 2000s, we had a couple of shows which, covered in Art Forum. We thought, we're here, we're in Art Forum. Didn't sell a thing. And after about 3 shows, we're staring down the barrel. And of course, the black taxi draws up, the famous black taxi of Charles Sargent. Now, Charles, and I hope he's A, not watching, and B, if he's watching, isn't going to sue me, because we used to like each other, set the bar pretty low in terms of ethical collectors, I think it's fair to say, allegedly. But he saved us. He bought half the show. And,
But at a discount, I bet, because he always got a discount.
It wasn't actually that much of a discount. Okay. It wasn't like the kind of mythical huge discount. His taxi's waiting outside the old store, and he shoots off. And in the end, that act of that unethical collector, if we're going to caricature him a little bit, actually then provided a basis for that gallery to go on. So there has to be a little bit of wiggle room here. So I'm not answering any questions. I'm I like doing what you're doing, just putting questions out there.
No, but I think it is interesting, this idea. I mean, when we had a preliminary chat on the phone before this discussion, you also said, interestingly, let's define ethics. I mean, we're not going to go down a philosophical rabbit hole here, because, I mean, obviously that's, that many millennia have been spent teasing this out. But I mean, you're right, it is a bottom line thing. And also, you freely admit, David, that you started off shopping. You started off buying stuff that went with your, look nice decor and this and that. And, you've shaped a collection as it's gone down the line. And I think also the market has expanded so much now that a lot of collectors now have got all institutional very quickly, but maybe still sell off quite quickly, maybe still do things that perhaps, I mean, let's just establish a few things about what collectors shouldn't do. Flipping is always bad. It's not just buying, it's not just the way they buy, and we'll talk about that in a minute, selling on, buying on, paying on time, being good to artists, all that is important, but also the selling as well. I mean, could you talk a little bit about, again, you're on the receiving end of this stuff,
I think there's a responsibility when you collect a large body of work, and I think if you collect a significant body of work from an artist and perhaps you put, all of it up to auction, that's just really catastrophic for that artist. And, there's nothing that they can come back from that, in a way. So I think you have to be in a dialogue with the gallery. You still have to understand the reason why you supported that artist from the beginning. And you still have to have a moral code of conduct that actually you are responsible for someone's career here and future. And so, you have to kind of be in a conversation about that, to think about what works could boost their career. I mean, auctions aren't a bad thing, but it's just, to have a strategy behind that, and not just a personal reaction or a kind of, a sort of, a more responsible consideration around it, of course, I think.
Because there was that terrible situation with Sandra Chia, remember, in the early 90s.
When Charles Saatchi, I'm sorry, we're demonising him, but he dumped a whole load of work.
Just dumped a whole load of work. So, I mean, there are examples of that, but also coming back to the ethics question, it's also, are you related to a particular pharmaceutical company? Things like that are very key about where your money's actually coming from. So I think those are things that are also important for where a collector is and, what they support and what they represent.
But having said that, of course, there's that old cliche, all money's a bit grubby around the edges, except for yours, I'm sure. But if you look too deeply into anyone's portfolio, a successful earning company is probably going to have something, in its back closet that we don't like too much. I mean, how much do you set store on that, Niru, when you're looking at people who are buying
Well, I think,
your artists?
and again, you've set the landscape out very well there. We've got a few levels there. In terms of if we've got ethics, first of all, do we all have a shared ethical structure? It sounds like we do, which makes it a bit boring. But we have to also, not assume that everyone involved in the art world entirely shares this wonderful liberal, progressive, ethical outlook that we have. And then you think, okay, look, where do we draw the line here? Are we going to kind of pull people up? Because I think the thing about perhaps, kind of how that money was made, that could be differentiated from what your set of personal ethics were. Now, if somebody seemed to be doing excellent things with their collection, but had some reprehensible views on, I don't know, still quite admired apartheid or something, you think, would you sell to them? Because, they might have some reprehensible personal views, but they're doing good things. So it's this idea of ethics coming into collecting, it's like, where can we, I think there's a slippery slope when we start saying, I don't like what you think, so I'm not going to sell to you. Because you could argue that if there's somebody who you don't like what they think, buying a piece of art might nudge them in the right direction. Who knows?
I remember Cornelia Parker saying she actually wouldn't have minded that some of her extraordinary drawings that were done with explosives or melted pornography tapes or guns or armaments did sit in the corner of a sitting room of somebody who actually dealt with the stuff. To have these lots of subversive
Yeah, we had that with the government art collection, didn't we? With, I think various artists saying, actually, I don't want, kind of Priti Patel to have this artwork behind me or whatever. And it's an interesting.
Well,
how do we also go with the change in ethics? Things that would have been completely normal 50 years ago are now regarded as unethical.
I think this is, and certainly over the last few years, you were touching on, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, also, and the environment, all these things, social media. There's a huge raft of change. Just to zero in on the Arts Council, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you don't want the whole collection suddenly to skew so that no middle-aged white man is ever going to get collected ever again because they've had such a good time in the patriarchy for the past few millennia. On the other hand, you want to reflect a wider demographic. You want to reflect the fact that a lot of demographics are being totally left out of the story. And then, of course, you've got to look at the kind of works that are being selected and the impact that will have on the individual artist's career, and how that will then perhaps shape other people to buy the work. I mean, even though you're an institutional collector, it's still a lot of considerations to have, isn't it, in terms of choices?
Yeah, of course. And you were talking about Saatchi. We benefited a lot from a number of works from Saatchi when he deaccessioned his works. So we have a broad range of works that came into the collection.
Did he donate them?
After that. I think we bought... we had a discount towards some of those works, but we wouldn't have been able to afford a lot of them at that point anyway. I think for us, we're also we're buying at a particular time, a particular moment. We don't buy broad ranges of work. We tend to be singular works, and where we would like to go back in time and the work's more expensive, we do try and find a partner or a collector that will support us. What I've noticed more so is that the landscape has changed greatly, and
Could
collectors,
we define that a little bit?
The way
from your point
collectors
of
are willing to support us because they see the benefit of the works going out again, being rehung, reused, reinterpreted. And we're finding that the support of works of artists who are, I suppose, more less affordable to the collection, we're able to support those artists as well and have that voice in the collection. Predominantly, we try and buy early career artists directly, as you were saying, directly from the artists and their voices coming through the collection.
But does that then mean that the collection... I mean, I remember when I was writing my book on collecting, owning art ages ago, that book now, but it seems a bit historical. But that, everyone talked about collecting in depth. You had to collect in depth. You couldn't just sort of, name check. And a good collector had a deep a loyalty to the artists that progressed. But you're saying that actually you can probably only afford early career works, unless somebody actually feels kind enough to give you a discount or donate it.
No, I would say we make the choice, not necessarily
Sorry.
just sort of
giving you loads of questions here.
Between that. And I think it's there's an opportunity to add to that collection through the museums and galleries by, interpreting the works differently. What we're doing is sowing a seed and supporting that artist. Last year we did a talk at Frieze, and we invited only artists to talk about how it has formed the collection through our acquisitions. You've also curated an exhibition. They're in the collection, and they all talked about, well, certainly at the point of pandemic, how important it was for them to be supported finaally, and what that really meant at that, really drastic time.
That's
so there is a real
about,
impact on
Hughes
that.
Gallery as well. Bottom line is everyone's got to live, haven't they?
How does the collector decide if the artist is ethically okay?
That's a great question.
Loaded question.
No, I'm serious, because there's lots of artists that I've met, some are now dead, some who are very old, and they would not be regarded as woke in any way, shape or form, and I love their work. Does it mean that going forward, I'm only allowed to buy works by artists that tick all the boxes?
Well,
I don't agree with that.
Look at all the huffing and puffing about Picasso, about Lucian Freud. I mean, all these kinds of
Eric
conversations. Yes, Eric Gill. Oh, yes. It is a knotty one, isn't it?
So I think that's where we've got to rewind from people's personal ethics, because I think it becomes impossible. Because you could, I'm not going to buy Julian Schnabel ever again because he's a repulsive human being. I mean, that was an example. Again, allegedly.
Caravaggio was a murderer. Does that mean you wouldn't buy a Caravaggio?
Well, exactly. That's why I think we can't do that. Well, I think whilst it's tempting to use ethics as some sort of thing, stick to hit people and say, look, I don't want to deal with this collector, I don't want to deal with this artist. I think, as I said, a very slippery slope. I think we have to go back to actions rather than beliefs. And what I thought was really interesting, switching slightly, is both of your institutions, the collection and the Arts Council acquisitions, you both have done something which is very interesting. You're both very transparent. So Louisa talked about that when she first came across the David Roberts Institute. And with the Arts Council, the thing that really struck me is you got up here and said, this is our acquisitions committee. Now, I went on, and I think they do a very good job and are marvellous custodians of the nation's art, but I went on the Tate's website this morning and plugged in, who is the Tate's acquisition committee? Didn't get any answer. I got lots of boards of trustees and lots of other information and a code of conduct, but it wasn't clear who's actually who are the collectors on there, who are kind of putting their input in. So I thought that's very refreshing for you to say that. But I think what we need is that transparency. So I think we should also look at the institutions as well, rather than just pick on collectors.
But also, I think it's interesting, talking of transparency, the way the art market runs. I mean, this is a market where practices take place in the art market that will be completely illegal anywhere else. Insider trading, market building, backroom deals. Now there's the money laundering legislation. Yes, so you do have to provide your passport details if you're paying, so you're not using it as some kind of, laundering thing. But that's quite recent. And there's still a whole raft of stuff that's very opaque and very shady. Look at the fact that most galleries, and probably yours as well, and the ones with gazillion pound earning artists don't have a contract. They do it on a handshake. All that is kind of fascinating, but also very problematic. I mean, what do you all think about this? Do you wish the art market was more regulated, or would that utterly ruin it and make it into a very static, restricted place?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, it's probably the only market that I operate in where I don't know if I'm buying something in the secondary market, I almost certainly don't know who's selling it to me. It's going to be, no, I'm serious. It's going to be through a gallery, it's going to be through an auction house. Wherever it's coming from, I don't know the person who's selling it. And he probably doesn't know the person who's buying it. And that's quite unbelievable when you're talking about, especially in large figures. It's taken to be completely normal in the art market. And I think the art market, I wouldn't want the art market to become completely regulated. I think that'd be a very bad thing. But I think it does need to become a bit more mainstream in some ways.
I suppose that's the appeal of NFTs now, isn't it? Because, it's all completely transparent there in the transaction, isn't it? And the way obviously it's digital, but
you can't fake them. It's in the blockchain.
So it's like it's got its own DNA somehow, isn't it? Really, and you find out the provenance, and it's all there and explicit. But I think within, as you say, you're still dealing with works that are 20th century, and you still have to be able to collect those works. And so, of course, like you say, it's very difficult to really mandate or legislate in a way that's that, as you say, would have a kind of way of, I suppose, correcting the situation in a way now. It'd be odd to kind of change that.
But there is other platforms to sell and to disperse work, and it is social media through Instagram and through other things. So you do have a greater transparency now, more so than you ever did have because of that, because of the digital online presence around what works are, and even seeing, the viewing rooms and things that happened post the pandemic. I mean, there is much more transparency.
Mm. What do you feel about, Deborah, because there's different prices for the Arts Council collection to me coming in off the street, to different agreements, it's all still very nebulous. How do you feel about negotiating that market? It's quite complex sometimes, isn't it?
Actually, I was quite interested from the artist's point of view, because I was just thinking about DACs, for imagery and how much we go through, we try to go through those routes, but also the education for artists and not being contracted. I think, what are they learning at art school? Is it the same that I learned little when I left school?
Artist Newsletter do have a whole set of things there that you can actually access, and you do have contracts that you can, present to museums, and they have different tiers in terms of what you should expect in terms of an artist fee. And so, there is a fair pay for artists there. That is already, they have guidance there.
So I think it's the responsibility of the artist as well. We always give out contracts, and those contracts, as we negotiate with the galleries, we don't always go through a gallerist, but we will always do contracts with a particular artist, and we always go back to them when we're rehanging or invite them to a show. It is very much about the artist being part of that process and part of that loan.
Yeah, and conversely, I think, you're right, obviously there isn't a contract necessarily with a gallery as such, but within that, there's also a freedom within that as well for an artist who's an independent figure as well, so And it's
Well, an artist can leave a gallery,
exactly.
and a gallery can eject an artist. I
No,
mean,
exactly. That can still happen, of course, but it doesn't have to go to
But I think it's interesting because what Deborah's saying about dealing with institutions, I think it is important that there is some kind of transparency around that, and there is a contract, and there is something there that's slightly different from the nuanced relationship of a dealer and an artist. I think actually it is key that is in place, and I think it's good that artist newsletters.
No, AN have done an amazing job, I think, because they are an artist organisation, actually fighting the corner for artists a bit and empowering artists. I mean, when I wrote a book on collecting art, I had this this mantra that everybody would throw at me, saying, as a collector, we feel that we are the custodians. We're not the owners, we're the custodians. And I would slightly raise an eyebrow sometimes as they were busily looking at how much it appreciated at secondary market value or whatever, and saying that collections had to wash their own faces and stuff like that. I mean, do you see yourself as a custodian, David, of the works that you have?
I've got to be honest. When I was buying a work of art when I was in my 30s and 40s, I thought I owned it. It was mine forever.
Yeah.
I'm 65 now, and I realise it's not mine. I'm just the person who happens to have it for a period of time, and then it will move on.
Yeah.
So whether it moves on to my children, or whether it moves on and goes to a museum, or wherever it ends up, I'm only part of its history, and quite a small part really, because the main person in a work of art is obviously the artist. It's not who happens to own it as it goes through its journey. But that's something that's only come to me as I've got older. I wouldn't have imagined that I'd have been thinking what I'm thinking now 25 years ago.
Niru, when you're looking at collectors, I mean, do you think, are they going to look after these works? Are they going to donate them? Are they going to, do you go down the custodian route when you're assessing who to...
Again, I'm going to slightly slice up your question slightly. To be honest with you, and it's interesting that when we've tried to pick somebody who was a negative example, we could only think of one in the past 30 minutes.
Well, there are a few around, but we just,
But what's interesting about that is it might also show that, to be honest, most collectors are pretty decent. And I think there's this idea that there's this new ethics of collecting, isn't there, on this website that's starting. And it had these stories, these horror stories of bad practice of collectors. There's wonderful lines saying, this happens all the time. You're like, actually, it doesn't happen all the time. It happens very occasionally, and then it's usually covered in the art newspaper. And you read it, and there's a wonderful salacious story about a collector who's done something terrible. You think, it's one great story. And you talk about it, but the fact of the matter is, it's once every 6 months or so. And it's very difficult to put a number on it, but I'd say that roughly 80% of the collectors or buyers I've met seem to be pretty decent people. And that could be me being incredibly naive, and perhaps they're all out there, doing terrible things. And there's 20% of people who you look at and think, okay, not quite sure. And I guess out of those 20% of people, 10% of them are evil but have no effect, and 10% of them are evil and have some effect. But what I'm trying to, I suppose, work out is I think this is a relatively small problem. And I think we're in danger at the moment of over telling people how wondrous we are as a sector, whether it's we are for the climate being important despite sending our crates around the world, or we are for ethical collectors, except we aren't really. And there seems to be a bit of post-Me Too and post-Black Lives Matters, this sector doing a lot of kind of signalling symbolically that we're incredibly virtuous. You kind of think, well, we're not that virtuous, but we're not evil.
But do you think the collectors, I mean, obviously my hackle's slightly raised because I've founded one of the founders of the GCC, Gallery Climate Coalition, trying to make the sector less vile and polluting, and the commercial world is way behind the public sector in this particular aspect, and people are actually counting their carbon and trying to be more equitable while at the same time going back to business after a pandemic and trying to kick in. And I think a lot of people have said within the sector that actually collectors could be really helpful in this respect, as indeed could artists, because they actually have the bargaining power. And if a collector says, actually, it's fine, you can ship my work by sea, not by plane. Actually, I don't want a super duper snazzy, shiny new crate. I can have an unused, a reused one. I am actually going to, perhaps it's not going to look so cool to have a private jet after all, because all the artists that in my collection, or a lot of them, find it all a bit icky now that I have this. I mean, do you see collectors being a sort of, having that kind of leverage? Because they're the ones that are buying the art after all.
Yeah,
I think,
sorry,
well,
I'll
I
get to
was
Edison,
going
so
to say,
yeah.
I think galleries have got far more influence than collectors on that. I think if a gallery says to a collector, you're not going to be getting it this week, you're going to be getting it in a month's time because we're shipping by sea, and that's what the artist wants, I think the collector will accept that. I think if there's a lot of things that galleries can put down a set of guidelines, and most collectors will abide by those, I think.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I think there's an issue with collectors lending works, particularly to public collections, where there's all sorts of really rigorous climate controls, which actually often aren't actually necessary, you know. So there's sort of ways, I mean, we're splitting hairs here, we can go down many rabbit holes, I'm not going to do that, but I think the whole environmental thing is quite an interesting one, because it is something that's come up, you know, relatively recently in the commercial art world, as indeed as Black Lives Matter, as indeed as Me Too, and I think all these issues are now out there, and people are being held to account, or increasingly being held to account, more than in the past, or is that just me being hopeful?
I just think there's just more transparency in general, isn't there? So you can't get away with it, really. I think you'll be found out, and I think that's probably more, not so much just, you know, signalling those kind of virtuous thoughts, but also just actually trying to be a bit more progressive, trying to actually do your bit to keep the planet alive, you know, those kind of thoughts.
Yeah, I know we just
Quite
came
important.
from a Raphael exhibition earlier, and it's just interesting hearing about some of the displays that are in the V&A, and they're actually photographic reproductions that are done on canvas. And I mean, it may not be the original work, but it is a very good representation of the original work. And, you know, and you almost feel like you're experiencing it. But of course, it hasn't been created and shipped and you know, and been moved around the globe, so to speak. You know, so, you know, there are ways of confronting that and kind of, you know, thinking about it imaginatively and responsibly. I mean, of course, it's not the same thing, but it certainly does give a good approximation, if you like, you know.
I mean,
Galleries are thinking about
collectors have a lot. Okay, so you're saying that actually it's the galleries, and of course the galleries have become extraordinarily powerful, a few of them. I mean, this sort of corporatization of the gallery sector, certainly in my professional lifetime, has just soared. The whole expansion of the market, the whole role of the art fair. I mean, you know, we're concentrating on ethical collecting here, I know, but the big galleries have quite a major role to play in how collectors collect, what is collected. Perhaps too much of a role, do we think?
I think, yeah, probably that's true. I think they have too much influence in many ways. I mean, many museum shows are now dictated to some extent by whether a wealthy gallery can afford to pay for the transport or pay for whatever it's required for that show, which means there's a sort of homogenization of what we see in museums. And there's lots of small museums do great shows, and there's lots of museum curators still do really fantastic things. But a lot of the particularly big museums, because of the requirement for footfall, and because of their requirement for big budget shows with very well-known artists, plainly they often turn to the very large galleries who represent those artists, because they're the only ones that can afford to put their hand in their pocket to help put on the show. And I think that's a process which means that more and more shows, however good the artists are historically, more and more, I think shows can become less interesting because of that.
And those big galleries, of course, dictate which collectors are the lucky recipients of whatever prized long waiting list artwork there is. I mean, that's a whole other factor, isn't it?
Can I say how interesting it is with the relationship between Art Fund and the London Gallery Week, where they're encouraging public sector to partner or work closer with the private sector, because you're right, with the resources and what the public sector can afford is quite limiting. So you're not always being able to do the larger shows, but then when you're partnering with some of the private sector, then there's an opportunity to work with some of the larger artists or, you know, contextualise those works. But it is a struggle beyond London for really small organisations, and certainly when they're all doing their national portfolio, and we all know it's going to be at a standstill at some point, I think there is consequences. And you're talking environmentally, you can't always, it's going to take a time for things to change, I think, and to address some of these things that they really feel passionate and heartfelt about. But we're on a journey, shall we say.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that the foundation, we were based in Camden, we did a lot of shows in London, but we sort of came to realise that whilst we want to continue doing things in London, there's a much bigger world out there, particularly in the UK, where there's not that much going on. You know, there's a tremendous limit to the amount of things regional museums can do, for instance, because of budgeting and everything else. And so we decided to try and push out of London about where there's a different audience, because the audience in London, let's face it, is pretty well covered. It's got, you know, it's got the Hayward and the Tate and all these other institutions that put on great shows, and they're all free. Whereas in the regions, there's just not as much, and there's not as much going on. There's not as much to see. There's less for people to go to.
I mean, the problem is it's an underfunded sector. And so if it's, you've got a chronically underfunded, well, as you know, public sector of visual arts, which now has, and that's not going to change, it looks like it, unfortunately, at which point the choice is we need money from galleries, big commercial galleries, or we need money from collectors. So we have the situation which has been the result of political choices over the years that we're left to deal with. And I think the reason why we're all struggling with this idea of ethics is that it's kind of been forced upon us and forced upon, you know, regional galleries, because suddenly they're like, we have to get into bed with Hauser and Wirth, or we have to get into bed with, you know...
Zablodovich's.
Yeah, absolutely. And that will be the only way of generating enough revenue to do these excellent shows. So it's a really kind of, you know, it's a real dilemma, but it's important to realise that there's something which has caused this, which is political choices, which have led to underfunding over the last 20 years.
But there's also the role of the public sector as a process of endorsement, and certainly when collectors are setting out, baby collectors or emerging, whatever word you want to use, a gallery will be much better disposed towards a collector who wants one of their artworks if that collector is a member of a patrons group, of a public institution, takes an active role with whatever public funded gallery they choose, whether it's the ICA, whether it's the Whitechapel, whether it's Serpentine, whatever. That's a form not just of endorsement of an artwork, but also a form of, I would argue, endorsement of a collector as well. That it shows that they've got ideas beyond flipping and making a few quid or impressing their friends with a trophy name that's been featured all over the place. You know, so the endorsement role of the public sector, I think, is often greatly underestimated, often by the public sector even, perhaps.
It's an interesting point, because I suppose as well, actually, you know, we're talking about what's happening in the regions and regional museums, but, you know, there are very distinct art communities that operate in the regions as well. It's affordable studio space. There's, there's a whole ecosystem out there that doesn't just exist in London, really. And, you know, whether it begins from art education and people still staying in the cities where they studied, and, you know, finding studio space affordable, as I said, making a living and making an existence, you know, it's kind of, it's a very core part of the ecosystem, really.
So an ethical collector has to be aware of these aspects as well, and not just be thinking about that.
But it's tremendously difficult, because I was involved with the Hepworth and Wakefield, and raising money for something in London is difficult, but not impossible. Raising money for something in Wakefield is almost impossible. But once you go out into the regions, it becomes much, much more difficult to raise funding.
Well, we have a great thing of levelling up now, which is obviously what's being thought through from the government.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that there's lots of incentives now to kind of, you know, endorse regional spaces. But yeah, it is something that has, rightly so, been ignored and been a black spot for a long, long time.
And that form of collecting bears greater fruit, one would argue, in that particular neck of the woods. I'm aware that time is ticking on, and I'm aware that we have a lovely live audience here, as well as our audience who's going to be seeing our recorded version. So I'd like just now to throw open the floor to anybody who wants to ask any questions. We've got this extraordinary lineup of fantastically informed people here, so let's make the most of it. Oh, how lovely. Somebody in the front. I'm going to hand you my microphone for the recording.
Thank you. I have a question about the difference between personal and public ethics. There's been a lot of consensus on the panel of like, oh, well, this is good and this is bad. But what do you do, whether you're as a gallery, as a collector, as a public institution, as an artist, when you think something and the world thinks something else? Because we live in the age of the Twitter pylon, and it's dangerous in a public sense. How brave do you feel in today's world, I guess is the question.
Maybe that's off this one. Look, I think that's a really, really good point. I think, look, as I think I tried to say earlier, and possibly didn't say clearly enough, one of the problems of all of us, you know, talking about ethics is this assumption that we share the same set of ethics. And that's just an incredibly vapid assumption. And we've got to be careful of groupthink, of assuming that everyone has the same set of personal values. And I think what I was trying to distinguish between was exactly what you said, personal ethics. And I think, and we've talked about it, I think it's dangerous, even though it's very tempting to go after people because of what you think they think, it's a very dangerous slope to go down, because I have no idea what you really think, and you point out how much I do what I think. So I think we have to, if we're talking about ethics, we have to look purely at actions, the decisions that people make as public-facing gallerists, institutions, artists. But I think going after them on a personal level and risking that kind of social media pile-on or whatever, I don't think it's not great, frankly. I think it should be avoided.
But there was positives, especially around AIDS and the activism that started through that. So there is a history to this, and it is important that it challenges those with money and those who have power. So yeah, there is a good history to it, and arts has often been part of that, and has been very brave and very powerful.
Would you be happy if your art was, say, in the office of a politician who you disagreed with wildly, and it was on, say, let's take Priti Patel again, because I presume you don't like her, having had a few pints with you in the pub before.
Thanks for that, but I don't think we've ever actually featured in this particular government.
If it did happen, how would you feel?
Well, I think, that's a government art collection, isn't it? So it was bought under a different government, and it's presumably will be under another government again, so I guess you just have to be philosophical about that, really. There's very little we could do to impact that in a way, and just hope that, they have a different taste, shall we say, to politicians we do prefer, really.
Yeah.
Because they do choose what they...
But most artists would love to be in the Tate collection, and the Tate was originally started by a sugar merchant who must have, to some extent, had his hands tainted. Why is there no call for the Tate to change its name? Or, I don't know of anybody that said that before, but it seems to me a strange one.
I think we should just celebrate risk, and sometimes, you rethink, it's reinterpreted, it's trends change, governments change, but if we don't take risks, that's the whole point of artistic practice. Otherwise, we debate it to death when we're in the, in our acquisitions committee, but it is something that we hope, if it doesn't go out at one point, it might come out at another point. So I sort of celebrate.
Yeah, and I guess once an artwork was sold, it's a little bit out of your hands, isn't it, really, if you're an artist? It's, it goes on its own journey, and it's a little bit like you were saying, David, earlier, about just having works in your collection that, you're looking after for, a temporal period of time, and then it moves on to someone else. But I think, there is something about, as long as you can sort of, as you say, know what the provenance is, or know, then that's kind of quite key. But there are moves ahead to do that, isn't there, already, I think, happening a lot more now. So
can I just say, in our collection, if you didn't agree for a work to go out and show, we would respect your decisions within that.
Yeah.
But it just means it might not go in that context. Someone else might choose in a different context.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because it's still an active debate with the artists. And with whoever's looking after their work.
I think that's that's a key thing, that conversation can happen and can still continue to happen. The same way about being able to collect work of an artist, you still continue the conversation. And I think that's, as ethical as you can be, really.
I think David's point is spot on. What we need is a bit of consistency here. Because, look, we can't solve the world's problems. We're the commercial art world. We're not like, it's not like, launching a rocket to the moon or something. But I think what we can try and do is be a little bit more consistent. So your point about Tate is spot on. So if we're going to question other institutions, we should also question, everyone equally. And I think that's a good start.
Any other questions?
So there was an article in the art newspaper during Frieze Week last year covering 7-figure auction sales by 2 very young painters. And there was some conversation online involving their gallerists after that, saying that those collectors shouldn't have bought that work if they couldn't afford to hold on to it. And I'm just wondering if the panel thinks that's a realistic position. If a collector buys something and then, through no sort of fault of their own, it becomes worth something that's life-changing to them, is it then an unethical act to get the market price for it?
I love that. I didn't read the article, sorry, art newspaper. But I love that, the way you put it, the gallerists were like, it's not our fault. You know, we just sold it to them, and now, like, look what they've done. I think that was, you know, I think you've got to take some responsibility as a gallerist in that case, first of all. I think that idea of just saying, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us, you know, these are very, very bad people, is just a trite answer, frankly.
I actually think in these cases, the works had probably been sold before the gallery representation came along. And because that's obviously one of the things that's changed a lot in the last 10 years, which is just how young these market phenomena happen. And so I think these are works that probably sold either from their degree show or shortly afterwards. And so their current gallerists are scathing about those collectors who bought at that point.
But surely the collector should be in conversation with the gallerist. I mean, they should have
Well,
gone to them.
that's my
Ideally,
question
that's
to you, yeah.
What would have happened is they would have gone and approached the gallery that represents the artist when they were considering putting the work up for auction. And not just, you know,
that always is the
responsibility.
protocol, isn't it? That
Yeah.
you don't flip into auction. You take the work back to the gallery that represents the artist and give them first dibs, as it were, on selling it. You may not get such a stratospheric price that you would at auction, or you may get a better price, because who knows if people don't want it at auction. And at least you're not going to then be, you know,
Well, in the same way that you're saying it's life-changing for that collector, it's incredibly life-changing for that artist too, actually.
I suppose
You know, it works both ways,
look, whilst
really.
we all agree that flipping is a bad thing, we can get that out of the way. And flipping is unethical, perhaps, if we get out there. And the way you put the question was fascinating, because what you suggested was actually those collectors do have some sort of right to do that without being castigated as being these selfish, venal people. And so whilst we can make these very broad brush, you know, conclusions, flipping is always bad. And you kind of think, well, is it? We don't know the circumstances of those two collectors. Perhaps they needed the money for an ethical reason or a very good reason. So I'm just really wary of like making these very kind of broad, you know, obviously I'm against flipping, I'm a gallerist, okay? And I'd love it if everybody came back to me and said, oh, do you want first dibs? It doesn't really, I don't know if that really happens in reality all the time. But I think we have to be really, really careful about kind of suddenly, you know, bearing down with the weight of moral authority on these two collectors and saying, like, what you did was evil, you must be cast asunder. Because we have no idea what their circumstances were. And I think the danger at the moment is, whilst it's really great that we're all talking about ethics and we're all talking about the environment and we seem to be a lot more engaged, we just need to be a little bit wary about, you know, suddenly being this big gang of ethical do-gooders who's going to kind of hunt down any bad people and, you know, cut off their legs or something.
Well, I don't think it's quite as extreme as that, but I think what we're doing is we're having the difficult conversations and they're coming out.
Yeah, so
We're
having
difficult conversations that we all agree with.
Why not
So
we
how
all agree
difficult is
with?
it?
We're not agreeing, actually. Actually, we're not. And actually, are we saying that these are bad collectors then? In fact, we can say they're bad collectors.
Okay, well, what we can say is as long as they're paying the artist resale right, and as long as the money is going to the artist, and this doesn't happen that often.
Right.
You know, the fact of the matter is that you can drill down to a definite problem which can be solved. Pay your artist resale right. And whoever the auction company is, insist on that.
But they are only capped at €12,000.
Yeah, it's
something.
incredibly
And there are some
ungenerous.
that don't pay.
People are
It's better than nothing. Better than
I
nothing.
believe, allegedly, the art newspaper was reporting on Ivor Bracker the other day.
Yes.
And you kind of think, well, if he isn't paying his,
No,
you know,
no, they
his
have to be paid,
small
definitely.
amount, these things, you know, there's a problem here.
No, the principle has to be established. Unfortunately, this is a huge conversation and it can go on all day, and our time is now almost up. So I'm going to curtail any more conversations from the floor, but I'm just going to ask each of my panelists one little takeaway, because we did say that we'd like some kind of, you know, recommendations to take away to make the art world more equitable and more ethical. And we've all now gone round in circles as to what that actually means. But nonetheless, I'm going to ask each of you just to give 2 takeaways as to what you think would make a difference or is important to consider if you're going to be an ethical, whatever ethical might mean, collector. And I'm going to start with my collector on my right.
I think the most important thing is to buy things you love. That's a lot of people. I've said this before at various things, and there's a lot of young collectors I can see looking at me very strangely, thinking surely it's all about value increasing and everything else. For me, if you buy something you love and you buy it on the basis that you believe you're going to hold it for a very long time, you never know what's going to happen, but you believe that, I don't think you can go far wrong.
So that's your ethical kind of benchmark.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, following on from buying something you love, you're actually buying it from an artist and you're buying an artwork. And I think you actually want to sustain that conversation with the arts. I think it's really important that you don't see it somehow as just a separate thing to how it will impact their career and impact them and their livelihood in a way. So I think that would be a good thing to take, is actually to continue that conversation in support of the artist, ideally.
And just to add to that, if you're having that conversation, hopefully you're also going to maybe commission something. And that's a great way to start supporting someone.
I would, I think it's supporting the artists first and foremost. And
When you say supporting, in what way?
well, financially.
So paying on time, are we saying? I mean,
Yeah.
how does
Pay
that
on
manifest
time and all
itself?
the others. But also for us, it's about where we were talking earlier about being custodians. We are the keepers. We will look after those works and care for those works. So it's also caring for those works.
The afterlife of the works once you've acquired them. Yeah. Niru.
I think just a good start would try and be as transparent as you feel you possibly can.
Well, I think we've all been pretty transparent today. Thank you so much to my panel. It's been a really fantastic conversation. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Crozier, for supporting. Thank you to the Art Newspaper team for making this possible. Thank you to Ed Alasanti for hosting us. And let's have a great London Gallery weekend. And what a fantastic panel. Many thanks.
Okay.